And we're live with Amber and Jeff to review Finnegan's Wake. Now over to his Jeffness.
Hopefully, stay in the hangout. I don't seem to have the best connection at the moment, but
Okay.
though I do see a great view of a shoe. Okay, so I was trying to find out if David B226 Morris wrote any reviews for the rest of the episodes, because I seem to stop around here, but I don't know if he picked it up later or not. But anyway, I don't have a review from him for this episode, but about Homicide Season 6, Episode 21, which is called Finnegan's Wake, written by David Mills, David Simon, and James Yoshimura, directed by Steve Buscemi, and originally aired April 24th, 1998. So all I got is this brief recap, and then, hopefully with the pictures and Ben's eloquence, he can fill us in on everything else that happened. But anyway, it says, an old man wanders into the squad room claiming to know who killed an 8-year-old girl in 1932. It turns out to be the oldest unsolved murder in Baltimore PD history. Falzone takes the case and visits Thomas Finnegan, a long-retired detective who was the last officer to investigate it. As they pursue the new lead, Finnegan charms the unit with stories from his years on the job, but also unsettles them by displaying the prejudices of that past time. The case bears many similarities to the murder of Adina Watson, and Bayless struggles not to let either of them haunt his mind. The guest star Charles Durning as Thomas Finnegan. So there's a brief synopsis of what happened. I'll turn it over to Ben.
Right, first of all, I will say that the way the character of Finnegan is written as a realistic person from that era who's slightly bigoted, and also G's reaction to that, I think is very good. And it was an extremely good performance by Charles Durning. Now, my only thought would be did they allow police officers that short at the time? Because it was a case in England that you had to be a male, you had to be over 6 foot to be a police officer. And I think Jeff has said before that certain police forces in the United States at a certain time had minimum height requirements. But that's just but the performance was very good.
I don't know. I have no idea. I've never heard of that before. I thought the military, I think, have certain height requirements, or used to, but I've never heard of the police having it exactly.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Maybe they do.
Oh, and I loved the line when there's a little bit of when sort of like one of the scenes between Falzone and Finnegan, where Finnegan asks Falzone, "How old are you?" Falzone says 29, and then he says, "I've got underwear older than you." Right. So I would give the story 9 out of 10. Did we get any extra stuff with? I like the fact that you have G showing his SJ traits of like he's a man of his time. All that phrasing and stuff, and all of that. And it would be really good, wouldn't it, Jeff, to actually do a series about the young G. What do you reckon about that? And what it was like for him with all the issues that would have been around race when he joined the police department, and his like personal story. So there's not really much else I can say about this episode. I mean, usually when it's really good like this. Are you there, Jeff? know if the sound is cut out or not. Oh, you're back.
You're back.
All right. Oh, you mean I dropped out? Oh, there.
Yeah,
So
well, for a while it was like, we're digitally blurry or whatever you want to call that. I couldn't understand what you were saying, and then you just stopped having sound altogether.
Oh, right. I was talking about how, like, there's little hints here of just how good a series it would be to, like, show the young G as a police officer. Like, the early years of this would be so good with G.
The early years of what?
The early year as G, as a police officer, dealing with this kind of, like, these hints at what, well, not just hints, but what it was like for a young black officer at that time.
Oh, yeah.
I just think that would be really good to, like, to do Homicide Life on the Street, but in the 60s, and to, like,
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. I mean, I know there have been some, cop shows that have been set in the past like that, but I don't know how close we've had to something like that.
because, like, you'd have, because it's like his character where he's talked before about he's had to choose between, what is it, black and blue. And in his case, it's not just not just black and blue; it's Italian as well. So,
Yeah.
What did you think of it, Jeff?
Think of what? The
The
episode
episode,
in general,
yeah.
or something specific?
Oh yes, you want specific. I keep
Because I have a
forgetting
hard
this.
time understanding you, so I'm not sure what you're asking me always.
Okay. What do you think about the Finnegan character?
So
what do you think of the Finnegan character? What do you think about the Finnegan character and the performance and all of that?
Well, okay. What I was going to say about this episode is that it reminded me a little bit of the movie Groundhog Day, not in the actual plot, but I mean in my perception of it, because the movie Groundhog Day is really good except for the very end. And there's only one thing I would change that would make the movie an even better movie. It would make it like one of my favorites of all time. And that was to change the ending. Have you seen Groundhog Day, Ben? I don't want to spoil it for you.
No, I've not seen it.
Okay. All right. Well, it's only like 28 years old, so you don't want to spoil that fresh.
Is it the one with Bill Murray in?
Yes.
Right, that's all I know. And it was like caught in the middle of a snowstorm and can't get out of it, and it keeps going round and round and round, something like that.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I won't spoil the ending for anyone who hadn't seen it, but I'll just say that there's only one thing I would have changed that would have, I think, made it better. And in this episode, I can't really say that it's exactly a change, other than I just would have made something clear. Because if you watch this episode, to me, if you watch if the entire thing is Bayless's dream, it makes it a better episode. And honestly, I think they should have put something at the end that at the very end that showed that the whole thing was his dream. Because there's stuff in it that's just like a little bit off. It doesn't seem like things that would have really happened, but they're close enough to things that it seems like it could be a really like vivid dream that Bayless was having. Because there's a lot of parallels again that shows him dreaming about Adina Watson, and I would have written it as, he's like sick with a fever and he's having these sort of dreams. And because you can, when you're sick like that, you can have some really intense dreams, and that's what I would have written it as. Because there's just little things that, you know, just, like finding the gun after 20 whatever years was just like, that's the most unrealistic thing that happens in it. But it's like the unrealistic things that happen, they weren't the kind of things that make me go, like, oh, that's like cringeworthy that this happened. It's just more like it would have been better if they'd established that the whole thing was a dream. The way Falzone talks to Frank when he tells him he did a good job on the case, the line about coming from you, that means a lot. It didn't sound natural. It sounded forced. And the stuff about, when they got to the part where they were talking about the case at first, and Bayless is like, he's the only one that's never heard of it. That to me really seemed like that they were going to make it, he was dreaming this because the reason he's never heard of it is because it's not real. But they had the parallels with this detective, that you're showing here, that had the Clara Sloan case, and then Bayless getting Adina Watson. So I thought it works better as if the whole thing is sort of this surreal dream sequence, as opposed to being something that really happened. I liked him a lot in terms of the way they wrote him and the way he was performed. Again, it once again goes back to how Homicide presents people as they are, with all sides, and doesn't try to paint them as being all either heroic or villainous. That there's people with a lot of different elements to them, both positives and negatives. And so, you had this guy, like the recap said, he's in the bar telling stories, entertaining everybody, but then just, one poor word choice, turns Lewis off to him entirely. So it's like things like that where, you establish that people aren't all going to say the things that will please everybody, But at the same time, like you said, G points out, the benefits of having this guy working on the case. Because obviously to him, the experience this guy has, it means something to him, regardless of what his prejudices are.
I also would have think that G, I know it's a big city, but maybe he wasn't a detective at the same time, because G joined the force in the 60s. Apparently this guy retired in 74.
Yeah, so G was probably still a uniform cop, hadn't become a detective yet at the time that the guy retired. Or else he was not in the homicide unit. Could have been in a different department as a detective. Bolander was probably there, though, because they already established that the Bolander had cases back to the 70s, so he might have been like a rookie or close to it in the homicide at the time that the guy retired.
It's actually hard to imagine Munch as a uniformed police officer.
We've seen him as a priest.
Right. So yeah, maybe because I remember, because he went up to a guy, Finnegan went up to a guy and said, "Oh, you still around here?" So it's like somebody's still working in the homicide unit. Yeah. He knew it.
And it was funny because he called him Mac, and then in the bar he's talking about how he knew all the different Macs, and it was funny that the one guy he recognized in the whole place was a guy named Mac, or else he called him that anyway, even if it wasn't his real name.
Yeah. And I like the bit about him connecting with Kellerman. And Kellerman saying, "I like your style." Because Kellerman would want to act like that. He would want to use those old school tactics. Mm-hmm. Did we get any more with the Kellerman storyline in this? Or did it...
No, which again goes back to my feeling like they very easily could have established that the whole thing was a dream, because they don't have... Nothing from previous episodes actually gets advanced in this story. It really is more of a standalone story. You have references to things from the past, but you don't have anything that actually changes anything that occurs in this episode. And we had the creepiest Frank laugh ever at the beginning in Bayless's first dream.
Yeah.
Where, first of all, he's randomly eating something and then isn't. And then he's laughing with lots of echo. So yeah, I thought it would have... I enjoy this episode, but I thought it would have been cooler if they had kind of interspersed more of the stuff, the dream sequence stuff, and where the whole thing, is part of a bigger dream. Because, I've seen remember a Cheers episode where Diane has like a dream within a dream. She wakes up from the dream and then she thinks she's awake, but then that turns out to be a dream, and that would have been a kind of a good way to go with this, in my opinion. You know, is just at the very end have Bayless like waking up from another dream.
Jeff, do you think that in general, sensing types don't like plots with a lot of dreams in them because it might piss them off? And it's like, oh, it wasn't real after all. But whereas you, like, you're happy, you're okay with.
I don't have enough information to make such a judgment about all sensing types. Don't like plots, no. Well, I would say this, because we've talked about this before, you know, as it compares to like something like Doctor Who that, you know, is a little bit more, you know, weird on a regular basis. That I would say that it is probably, in general, sensing types prefer things to be a little more straightforward in the way they're presented. But I don't think... So if there was a show that was doing nothing but having weird dream stuff, probably that wouldn't be as popular. You know, that would be... Intuitives might like something like that more, I would theorize. But that's to me why this episode could work as, you know, a standalone thing, is that, you know, they didn't do that on a regular basis, and it works as kind of a good experimental episode, like when they did the, you know, the Gas Man episode, where they focused on the, you know, the villain or the killer that came back, you know, to try to kill Pemberton.
Oh yeah, that was cool. I like that. I like that. That was good.
Yeah, and that's an example of, you know, Barry Levinson wanted to do something a little different, and I think, you know, this episode is like they couldn't quite fully commit to that, but I still enjoy it. It's just there were just a couple of things they could have done differently, and really made one main difference. Because the way it is, it's ambiguous in that, you know, I don't think it's too big of a spoiler to say that there's nothing that happens in this episode that really gets referred to in the future either. So it could have been that the whole thing was a dream, but they never actually do anything that reveals that. It just ends. You know, so that's, I prefer to look at it that way. I think it's a better episode if I feel like that's what it was than because they never actually specifically contradict that.
But so ultimately, you think it would be better if it was a dream, just to like cover up all these niggly plot holes that you see?
Yeah, because then it's like you can easily say, you know, it doesn't have to obviously be 100% realistic because it was a dream. But there's enough in it that you can say it's realistic as a vivid dream somebody could have, where they see things that seem like they were so real that when he wakes up, he doesn't, you know, he has to question whether this really happened or not. So it's, you know, there's plenty of people I know of, including myself, that have had dreams like that, where it's like it feels so much like real life that when you wake up, it's like, wow, did that actually happen? You know, because there's, I mean, in times in the future where I've thought about something and like, oh, I did such and such, and then, but wait a minute, that didn't actually happen. That was in a dream, because it was that realistic. And so that's the kind of thing where with this, it seemed like it would have been perfect for that, because, you know, like I said, there's things in it that don't completely make sense or are just a little bit hard to believe, but still make for a cool story. So that's the way I choose to look at it myself. But the thing that keeps it from being like, you know, a 10 out of 10 type episode is that they didn't establish that, really. And I would have done that if I was the one in charge. So
for you, Jeff, it's like when you're watching Homicide, like realism is like a really important criterion for you, but not as much when you're watching Doctor Who. Is it because like you just got yourself in like a different mental frame?
Yeah, I mean, Doctor Who is not set in reality, so to speak. I mean, from the beginning, it's you're, you know, expected to accept, you know, things that are not established as being reality on planet Earth, in terms of a dude from another planet with the ability to travel through time and space. You know, so there's, from the very beginning, they establish things that are outside of the realm of like human knowledge of science. So when you start that way, then, you know, the premise is not going to be the same. Whereas the premise of Homicide is you're treating this as, you know, it's as the real homicide unit, you know, but obviously there is artistic license taken, because every show does that isn't a documentary. and even documentaries do sometimes. But I mean, but the way it's presented, you know, it's a fictional program, but it's based on reality. So, you know, to expect it to be regularly unrealistic, I think would, you know, diminish the program.
Yeah, and it all comes down to, like, I mean, because you know quite a bit about the procedure of like the real life procedure of investigations, and so the so does it also, do you get the, it's just like anything that's unrealistic, does it take you out of the drama of it?
If it's too bad, yeah. I mean, not always. I can kind of be like, okay, that's a little hard to swallow and not really be that effective. But that's why I mentioned stuff like finding the gun. You know, it's not one of those things where you're like, if it's a movie, you're like, well, they'll ruin the movie for me that they had this, you know. But it's one of those things that in Homicide, a show that, you know, is not afraid to have things not turn out for the good guys, so to speak, in terms of cases don't get solved, you know, suspects turn out to be false leads and interrogations go nowhere, stuff like that. They're not afraid to have those things. That it would have been more in line with Homicide as it is to have them not find the gun.
But I mean,
and they could have even still solved the case another way, but for that, it was kind of a cop-out to have that.
Right. I mean,
but like I said, it's not enough for me to sit there here and say, oh, that, you know, I was so bothered by that I couldn't enjoy the episode, because that's not true. But so it has to be something pretty egregious for me to really be like, oh, like this made me really not like the episode. We talked about the episode Partners back in season 3 was the closest to that I can think of, because the stuff with the cop who was beating his wife was just so TV movie of the week to me that it made it hard to enjoy the episode as a whole. I was still able to, even that one, there was enough strength in that episode, even some good Pimbleton G scenes, that I still gave the episode a 6 out of 10, because I thought overall it's still a little bit, you know, above the positive line, but that other story really, you know, was lousy. So this episode we're talking about today, there was nothing that made me feel that way about it. I thought it was a cool episode. It just could have been cooler if they had just done a couple other things with the story that they didn't do.
I think that I could say one of the reasons that, yes, it's a little bit of a cheesy ending that they get caught with the gun by a fan, but I would say what it sort of like balances out by the fact that they weren't able to solve the Adina Watson case. So it's sort of like the good luck, bad luck sort of balances itself out. And it's not the case.
They weren't able to solve what?
Because they weren't able to solve the Adina Watson case.
Oh, yeah.
And so they keep on referring to this case that they weren't able to close, whereas they were able to close this one.
Yeah, and I don't know. I do know that the real case that Adina Watson was based on was never solved, and that's the reason why they didn't. Tom Fontana resisted the network wanting them to eventually solve the case. He said he really stood his ground on that, because he said it would be unfair to the real girl and her family that their case was never solved, to present it as having a happy ending on the show. So he really was determined not to have them solve that. I don't know if the case that this episode was based on really did get solved after all those years or not. That one I'm not sure. I know that it was supposedly based on a real story in terms of the really old case that wasn't solved, but I don't know whether they actually did eventually solve that one. I would have to go back and look it up again and maybe find out.
Maybe one.
Because there have been some real cases that were solved after many, many years when new evidence arrived. But this one seemed, the reason I think it works better as a dream is, again, it was just a little too easy. Is like things just fell into place in a way that, again, makes for a cool story, but doesn't make for a very realistic story.
Yeah, I mean, I use that criterion a lot in judging the new Doctor Who. Like and ever since I watched, when they remade Battlestar Galactica and put this huge emphasis on realism, it's like I judge things by this realism criterion of, like, especially in like characterization and people making tough choices. And usually it's a psychological realism that I'm more interested in than, you know, how does the faster than light drive work?
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
you and I have talked about before. We could go on and on about what's wrong with the new Doctor Who, but I mean, the basic
Oh yeah.
the basic problem is they don't take themselves seriously enough.
Yes.
It doesn't have to be necessarily realistic, but it has to be taken seriously enough to have drama and suspense and intensity to it instead of just being goofy. You know?
Yeah.
And that's the biggest problem with them is just not is looking at it too much as a goof and not as something that could be you could actually tell pretty good intense stories with.
Yeah. Oh right. Oh, but I suppose we can finish up by talking about what sort of character and temperament do you think Finnegan is?
I would say he's probably an introverted guardian, but maybe not. It could be, he could be another ISFJ, could be an ISTJ, could be an ESFJ, somewhere in there.
I mean, I'm sure SPs can be bigots too, Jeff.
Well, I didn't say anything about that. I'm
No, you
looking at
didn't.
him as a character. Looking at him as a character and see that no, I think he's a guardian that has a lot of tactical ability, which again comes with the job, and being
Yes.
on the job that long, he obviously, learned a lot of tactics as far as, some of the physical things he mentioned that they that they don't allow him to do them anymore, but also some of the verbal tactics and the things that he used, like even in this episode that he used, not being completely honest with the people they were interviewing, telling them things to try to get information, things like that. So, but I think Guardian cops are fully capable of using those tactics. But his general demeanor is very focused on the past and very focused on comparing today with the past.
Right. Yeah.
Because and some of that obviously comes with age. You can say, well, you talk to any 78-year-old guy, even SP types, they're going to talk about the past a lot. That's probably true, but even talk about from the past is different. And he focuses very much on things like the way things look, the nationalities or the race of people and stuff like that, how they were and how they are different now. Like it almost offends him. Or does offend him that the makeup of the department that he sees, that it's not like the old days. I doubt that, most SP cops are going to spend much time worrying about that, I mean, they might mention it, but as sort of a joke, but they're not going to actually have this, take offense to it, like this isn't how it's supposed to be kind of attitude.
Yeah, and also it's not just the change; it's also that they've actually said in the show that the Irish did used to be in charge of the Baltimore Police Department.
Yeah, that sounded like there were sort of eras, and actually after that, at least one mention, episode they mentioned because the previous night shift commander that retired or sort of had a forced retirement, he said that basically after the Irish that it was the Italians that did run the place, which is why Finnegan makes some comment about it was true that he heard the Italians took over the department. So apparently there was this era after the Irish that the Italians were. And then it sort of, after that, it maybe started to mix up a little bit. But they don't really go into why those things happened. But that has been mentioned before. That there was sort of an Irish era and then an Italian era and then whatever followed that. So.
Yeah. I think maybe in the era with Al Harris, where they may have mentioned it. And there was that episode, I can't remember, where he had one of his old contacts assassinated in order to keep a secret, and how he became commissioner.
Yeah, and he also says that G had some kind of run-in with some old racist Irish guy too, and so he when G didn't follow his orders or whatever, then he got back at him by promoting Gaffney to stick it to him like he did, to remind him of that other guy.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and that was I think it was Al House's character, the commissioner, that actually promoted Gaffney.
You're mixing his character's name and the actor's name together.
I forgot what's the character called?
Yeah. The character is Harris, but his first name wasn't Al. The actor's name is Al Freeman Jr.
Oh right, okay.
Yeah.
Oh yes, about the tactical thing. He did do like an SP thing, like when he conned the diving team guy to give them an extra like half an hour.
Yeah, like I said, even it's so he's learned the tactics, but even that, the way he appeals to him is sort of from like more of an emotional angle. So I'd say that if that was more of a, I don't know, more of a feeling tactic.
You know what I think one change I would have made is I would have actually made the girl black as well. So it's like, even though he is a bit bigoted and racist, as they could point out to that, but hey, and it says, you know what I mean? Like, to get that, like, maybe contradiction in there.
I could see what you're saying. I think it works either way, but yeah, that would obviously, I think that might have come off a little bit too trite to me, but, but yeah. And I didn't have a way to freeze the picture as you were going through, but you had the picture of like the very last picture that they show Bayless.
Yeah,
and
I'll go to the end.
And that's the thing, is he looks like, in the scene, yeah, he's just watching this on television. But that, I was like, the way they have him made up, or the way he's looking at that, like, he's been crying or whatever, like, that was perfect. It's just that would have been the scene where I would have had him, he was all sweaty and stuff because he had a fever or whatever, and he was having fever dreams and stuff. That's the change I would have made. But it was like, it's just missing that tiny little element that I would have added. But it's still good.
Do you think networks are afraid of putting dreams in because of what happened to, well, not just because of what happened to Dallas, where they had to pass off a whole season as a dream?
I don't think in general they are. No, I think probably, they probably want to stay away from it being used as a convenient plot device over and over again. And yeah, having an entire season be a dream is a little bit much, but obviously they did that one time, and it kind of was a bit of a ridiculous thing, but at the same time, I can say there's a part of me that sort of respects that, being kind of a bold move. But yeah, I don't think having something from time to time, in the course of a show where you do that is a bad idea entirely. I think it can be used in a way that's still effective. And like I said, in this episode, I think it would have been. 'Cause I know probably some in the audience would have reacted badly to that, would have been like, oh, that's kind of a cop-out. But I would have looked at it as the opposite, that it was the best way to place that episode in a context where it made more sense but still was effective,
Yeah, I mean, I'd go along with that, Jeff, if it meant there was a change in Bayless's life, that the dream had an impact on Bayless.
Yeah, and I think there's ways they could have done that, especially with what, again, without spoiling anything, the kind of the direction they go in the final season with Bayless, I think it would have fit into that very well.
Right. So, yeah. I don't think we have much else to say about this episode, folks.
All right.
So I give it 9.
I will also give it a 9. For an average of 9. And next week we begin our wrap-up of the 6th season, because it's a 2-part finale. So very, very different change in tone for next week, with a very intense episode called Fallen Heroes, Part 1.
And I might even watch both parts so we can review both together.
And I did mention at the very beginning of this review that Steve Buscemi directed this one. So I don't know, was there anything you felt specifically about the direction, or is it, we didn't mention that really, huh? All I can say is I thought it was really good.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine. I mean, it's part of the thing is that, well, everyone acted. I mean, I suppose, how much acting had Charles Durning done? Like, was he like in retirement a lot before he came into this, or was he still like active? He
I'm
acted
pretty sure. I
quite
can't
well.
remember. He was on that. He was on that show Evening Shade with Burt Reynolds, and I can't remember when that ended, but it was sometime in the '90s. So I don't know if this was just after that or not. But this wasn't the last thing he did, because he was in Everwood several years later after this, playing the main character's father. So
Yeah,
I think he pretty much acted up till pretty close to when he died.
it's a good job, and of course, when you're directing television, it's like you're against the clock, and also especially in those days, you're filming it. Well, you're filming it on film. You're recording it on film and using a single camera, so you got to move along at a pace that's a very quick pace. You know, not like the time that you got when you're doing a movie. You have these long shoots, like 12-hour day shoots.
Yeah.
And so, just from a logistical point of view, it's a good job of director.
All right. Well, so it's still at the end. We both gave it a 9, and the next episode is Fallen Heroes Part 1. So join us next time for that.
Bye bye, folks.
Bye.